Hey YouTube, did you know that Dimir Death Shadow might not be as dead as I thought it was? Well, apparently that's the case. So let's go through a league. I decided to run with Dimir Death Shadow. So some of the cards I wanted to really try out this league: Narset, Parter of Veils. If you see it here in the 3-mana slot, 3-mana Planeswalker, most known for its static ability that prevents your opponent from drawing more than one card each turn. So in the face of cards like Up the Beanstalk, Omnath, the One Ring, hopefully it'll help slow down our opponents a little bit. Force of Negation as an excellent answer on the turns we want to tap out for threats like Narset or Murktide Regent, to kind of put the brakes on whatever our opponent tries to develop in that small little window we give them before we get to untap with our counter spells, Stubborn Denial, and Drown in the Loch. We've got Orcish Bowmaster to hopefully fight over some of these cheap little threats you get in Modern, as well as some of the big haymakers like, Gristlebrand, but more importantly, the One Ring. We've got a slew of spot removal with Dismember, Fatal Push. We've got Thoughtseize to rip apart the hand, Death Shadow, Murktide to close out the game, and some utility cards like Dress Down to make sure that our opponents pretty well stopped in their tracks. So let's take a look at it. In the sideboard, to go with this awesome game one plan, we've got a couple copies of Spreading Seas for big mana, an extra Narset if our opponent's really egregious about drawing cards, extra Dress Down, a slew of 1-mana counterspells, including Stubborn Denial, a Stern Scolding, a Spell Pierce, and a Flusterstorm, each with their all own particular benefits and drawbacks. We've got a copy of Break the Ice, 2 Surgical Extraction, one I'm really interested in trying. I've been brainstorming, wish we had that in Modern, brainstorming ideas of how to fight some of these Up the Beanstalk decks. And one of the ideas we worked on in the Discord, which I'll have a link to the Control Freak Discord down below if you want to come suggest some ideas of your own. We brought up the idea of Surgical Extraction on the One Ring. We have a lot of ways of dealing with that first ring on the stack, but if we can get rid of all the rest of them, or that, not the first ring, the first beanstalk on the stack, because that's the more popular option at the moment, apparently. We can deal with that first beanstalk on the stack. Surgical might give us a way to get rid of the rest of them, slow the deck down from being able to draw as much. We've got 2 copies of Engineered Explosives, an Unlicensed Hearse, and a Stone of Eric in the sideboard. So, a lot of one-ofs, but you see that a good bit with shadow decks when you're not really sure what you want access to. Or even if you are sure, sometimes you just want flexibility. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into the matches. Make sure we take some extra time to go over sideboarding, so that maybe if you decide to bring Dimir Shadow to your next RCQ, you won't be lost in the sauce. So round 1 on the draw, we've got a Force of Negation for a turn 1 troublesome play. If our opponent doesn't do anything too scary, then hopefully like Drown in the Loch can start picking up the slack a little bit. We see a Shelldock Isle, so immediately we know, hey, this is mill. Not a lot of Shelldock Isle decks going around. Decide to go ahead and jam the Shadow because I've got that Force of Negation, so I can fight over a Drown or something on my opponent's turn. Drown or a Fatal Push, especially since they don't have black mana yet, so they can probably only cast 1 removal spell. And if they pass back to my turn, I get access to Drown and Counterspell. So I made a decision here. My opponent cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter. If you haven't seen the converted mana cost of this deck, it's actually very high. With our Murktide Regents, we've got Narset, we've got Force of Negation, we've got Street Wraith. So Tasha's really not as dangerous against this build as it is some of the other ones. So I actually decided to just let this go. They hit 10 cards, which, great. You spent your whole turn, you hit 10 cards. I still have my fetchables in my deck. And now I've just got a Shadow that's going to clock you with as much counter magic as I can possibly hold up. And we actually get to let another 2 Tasha's Hideous Laughters resolve. And I only let the second one resolve because I checked my exile after the first one to make sure that they hadn't hit too many of my high cost cards. But we're able to just kill them a couple turns later with Dress Down Shadow because we held up all our counter magic. But it's just a matter of identifying that I don't think Tasha's is a card I'm particularly scared of here. Especially when all I want to do is protect my shadow, and tapping off of a way to protect my shadow could create some more headaches down the road. So let's talk about sideboarding. Ended up cutting some of the Narset Parter Veils. It seemed a little expensive and a little clunky. It doesn't really impact the game very much, so it's not really something I'm wanting to tap out for. There's a high likelihood that my opponent's going to mill over some number of fetchables or maybe Field of Ruin me off some lands. So I don't want to bog down my hands with a bunch of expensive cards. So I decided to ship back the Narset to the sideboard, cut a Bowmaster because it doesn't kill a crab, and that's kind of the only thing you care about in the matchup. Board in the Flusterstorm, the extra Stubborn Denial, the Spell Pierce. You could if bring in like Unlicensed Hearse if you want to help fight over things like Surgical Extraction out of the other side. But I think we just have a pretty solid game plan with being able to Thoughtseize, Threat, Counterspell back up. So I don't really want to bog down my hands too much. That first hand, just not really doing anything. Like, I don't have interaction for a crab. I don't have a good threat. I don't have a counter spell to protect anything. So, all in all, it's a hand that's just, like, not accomplishing anything. This second hand, I do have a Drown in the Lock to fight over a crab. And then I've got a Murktide Regent. So, if my opponent goes heavy on nuking my yard, then I can't just drop a big Murktide down. You'll see me fetch and shock on my turn right there. It's because if my opponent has Archive Trap, then I want to make them go ahead and use it. If they don't have Archive Trap, then I don't want to wait for their turn and give them a potential another draw to hit Archive Trap. And then here, I decided to slow the clock instead of get the Murktide down, because if I play out the Murktide and they just untap and have a Drown in the Lock to kill it right there, then I haven't really accomplished anything. But if I slow down a turn, then I get to Thoughtseize into the Murktide. See that all they've got some Fractured Sanities. And now we just have a 2-turn clock and hope they don't find an answer to the Murktide in that time. Which, thankfully, they do not. They just find some extra lands and Murktide's able to get across the finish line. A lot of that because we slowed them down on the crabs and didn't try to fight over things that we couldn't control. On to round 2. Looks like we're up against Burn. Inspiring Vantage into a Swift Spear. Pretty big giveaway. Shock in the Watery Grave so I can Fatal Push the Swift Spear. Thankfully, they give me a target to force a negation. Dress Down is really good against Burn, but I feel like I'm going to be cycling these Street Wraiths to get my life lower, so I don't really care about the card draw. And I'm a ways off of this Shadow Mattering, so I don't really want to hold up a bunch of cards to try to enact some game plan that's not guaranteed, which would be the Shadow plus Dress Down. So decide to opt for holding on to the Consider instead. Get some card draw, get a little manipulation here. I'm okay fetching up a tapped land because if my opponent does do something, then I've got cycled Street Wraith to save my shadow. And then this was an important point. I had the Force of Negation, just a hard cast force, so I'm protected from one burn spell. I cycle the Street Wraith to make this 6 damage intentionally, so that I can Dress Down next turn and have a lethal shadow attack, which is also why I'm not cycling the second Street Wraith. And after this, it's going to become, if it doesn't say Boros Charm, I don't care about it. And I want to make sure that I Dress Down on their instep so that I've got Force of Negation held up, Stubborn Denial held up, and can go to my turn, like Stubborn Denial something on their instep. I'll go to my turn with hard cast Force of Negation. I don't want to be in a position where I drown in the lock on my turn and only have stub to back it up and no force. So on to game 2, sideboarding against Burn. Street Wraith is probably the easiest cut. Dismember can be a pretty easy cut after that. Thoughtseize, I really like keeping in Thoughtseizes, especially on the draw, because Sanctifier on Vec can give you some fits. Bowmaster's not the most impactful card. Narset's pretty slow, so trimming on some of those things that either aren't impacting the board, aren't getting the game over with, or require you to tap a bunch of mana at sorcery speed are pretty big deals. Bringing in a lot like the mill matchup, the 1-mana counter spells, the Flusterstorm, Stubborn Denial, Spell Pierce, and the Stern Scolding in this matchup. And then bring in, usually I'll bring in the Engineered Explosives just as an additional way to help fight over like Sanctifier and Roiling Vortex. But I think this time I didn't have more stuff I wanted to bring out. So yeah, that's about all we got. A lot of times your sideboarding options are very much, speaking of the Sanctifier, are very much trimming things that are like marginally better, even if you don't get a big upgrade out of them. Could have very easily trimmed out the last Narset for an additional EE. That would have been fine. But I was kind of hoping that maybe the one Narset would give me some card advantage to close out the game. Counterspell's okay, but I do already have Counterspell, Flusterstorm, Stubborn Denial, and I just want to get spells in my yard to be able to get down a big Murktide. And my opponent doesn't seem particularly interested in like slinging off spells for no reason. They saw that I'm on Death Shadow after game 1, so they're kind of slowing it down some, which is great for me. It gives me a little bit of extra time to kind of set up, sculpt a hand a little bit. Got a stub for the first path. Can't do a whole lot about the second path, but, you know, it happens. If we had not deployed a threat for like another turn, then maybe we could have been a little more conscientious of it. Getting to cash in on this Flusterstorm is huge here, especially against the Boros Charm. So my opponent's down to 2 cards. They do have 2 redraws off the Sunbaked Canyons, but they have to be a little slow with the redraws because they can't do them on their turn because of Narset, which means they'd have to use the mana on my turn, and it does get a little mana intensive to crack some Sunbaked Canyons. So find another Dress Down, which Dress Down can be pretty useful here for stopping haste threats, as well as like taking away the pro-black from Sanctifier so we could dismember it. I don't want to waste a counter spell on a Swift Spear because I have the option, like we see right here, to eventually find a Shadow. And then having double counter spell Stubborn Denial means I feel pretty safe just dismembering, getting down this Shadow, holding up all my interaction. You do have to pay attention to the life total a little bit. So for me, if I'm up against Burn, I'll try my absolute best to not fall to 4 life or lower. Not only because Boros Charm, but because some people will play Exquisite Firecraft, and I want an additional answer to that, as in my life not getting down to 4 or less. So if I can afford to stay above 4, I gladly will. But if I can't, so be it. And then here I know I'm safe from Firecraft because we're at my opponent's in step instead of their main phase. But if they had started off their main phase with like a burn spell to put me down to 3, I would have countered that. Because I do not want to be in a position where I'm 4 or less and they Firecraft me. Either way. On to match number 3. Our opponent mulled to 5, kept a couple lands, Beseiju, Dryad, Sakura Tribe Elder Ren. So I'm assuming it's a Scape Shift variant. We get an attack in the old post stub Land of Shame here. You love to see it. Scape Shift, traditionally a pretty good matchup for the Shadow variants that are just high on counter spells. Because you get down to threat, there's not that many payoffs that you really care about. Force Negation's a good pickup. I know they're going to go up to 5 lands here. 5 lands is okay because that means they still can't Titan without another land. They can't Scape Shift for lethal. Then countering this Search for Tomorrow, mainly because I don't want them to get to that 6th land and be able to Primeval Titan. That could create some issues for me. So instead, we're just going to counter whatever we can off the top. Go to game 2. Sideboarding against Scape Shift. Surgical Extraction could come in, but I think I opt for kind of a little more conservative approach. Since my main deck is already really good against like the Scape Shift plan, I don't really feel like I need to board in extra cards to deal with it. I kind of want Surgical more for the explosive combo matchups like the Living Ends, the Rhinos, the Beanstalks combo, stuff like that. These slower non-creature spell matchups like Stubborn Denial, Counterspell, all that's good enough. My Fatal Pushes and Dismembers are pretty bad. Against Sakura Tribe Elder, they just sack and response, so it doesn't do anything there. Against Dryad of the Elysian Grove, they're a bit better, but by the time my opponent gets to 3 mana, hopefully I can have some sort of a counter spell available anyway. End up boarding in like the Flusterstorm, the Stubborn Denial, the Spell Pierce, just to fight over some of that early cheap stuff. And then my last board in was something, you know, that card that does the thing. I don't think it was an extra Force Negation. Oh, the extra Dress Down. Because the extra Dress Down stops the Titan ETB. That's what it was. So we got a Suspended Search for Tomorrow. I don't really want to stub. I've already got Drown and Counterspell. I think people get in trouble sometimes of, oh, I see a Counterspell. I want the Counterspell. Give me the Counterspell. And like, the Counterspell is only as good as the pressure that it's supporting. Like, just saying no for a turn and giving your opponent another turn to draw and do something isn't that impressive, but saying no for a turn and cutting like one of their 2 turns of their clock off is a huge deal. I've got the Force Negation up to fight over a Veil of Summer if they did have one. But since they do not, I just get to Dress Down and kill them. So Dress Down putting in some serious work so far. I think it's had 3 kills already in 3 games. It's not quite Battle Rage, but I do think it's got some utility, especially in lists like this that you want to be a little more conservative early on. So we're on to round 4. Opponents on Scam. They did have to mull pretty low. And I'll point out something funny here in a second. So they Thoughtseized our Fatal Push. We top decked to Thoughtseize to take their Dolthy. Their next 2 draws were double Grief, because they pitched a Grief to Grief and then got to Not Dead After All, which we get to Dress Down. You got to remember, let me point out the timing here, and I'll point out the funny thing I was going to point out. So if you're going to Dress Down on a Grief with like an Undying effect, know what the different outcomes are for the different timings. So if I Dress Down before Grief hits the battlefield, like they've evoked Grief off the Grief, Grief's on the stack. If I dress down before it hits the battlefield, they don't get to look at my hand, but the Grief stays around on the battlefield. It's there. It's permanently in that spot. Uh, if I wait for them, like Grief has hit the battlefield, trigger goes on the stack. If I dress down then they can, after my dress down resolves, they can not dead after all, and Grief gains the ability to come back. It's because of the timing. Dress down strips away the abilities, not dead after all gives the ability back. So if you dress down before the Grief, after the Grief has gone on the stack, enter the battlefield, the trigger's gone on the stack, before they not dead after all, then the Grief's going to come back. It's not going to take another card from you. It's going to enter back as a 3/2 menace with the aura, the not dead after all aura attached to it. But it's not going to take a card. If you wait for them to not dead after all on the Grief, or use whatever their Undying effect is, and then dress down, so they've gone on the stack, or they've resolved the Grief, they've taken your card, they Undying on the Grief, then you dress down after the Undying effect is resolved, then the Grief goes away to the graveyard permanently. It loses that ability to come back, because that's an ability that's granted to it while it's on the battlefield, and dress down strips it away. So make sure you time that correctly for the desired effect. If I had a removal spell, maybe I dress down before the Grief comes in, or let them keep it around. But I don't want them to have the Grief, so I kind of have to do the play of let them resolve the Grief, take a card, then go for the Undying effect. It's less risky because I have the dress down and the drown in the lock, so I'm going to have an answer for it one way or the other. But if you only have one answer, that might affect when your timing is. So get to deal with the Grief. My opponent was not a happy camper at this moment. They let me know in the chat that they thought I should go to the casino in not so exact terms. And I thought it was kind of funny because, hey, I just drew normal cards for my deck. Also, they just top deck back-to-back Grief to be able to scam here. So we're kind of both a little bit lucky. But I know their last card's Lightning Bolt. We find a Shadow. I could flash in Bowmaster there, but I don't want to leave myself exposed in case they top deck to Terminate. So I'm just not going to tap off of Stubborn Denial ever. I don't want to Thoughtseize because I don't want to put myself dead to double Lightning Bolt. They end up furying away my tokens off the bolt, and I say, cool, I've got a lethal Shadow. Let's do it. So on to game number 2, sideboarding against Scam. For me, I like to trim just like a couple Wraith, couple Thoughtseize, and maybe a Stubborn Denial or two. The Wraith, because it is a game that goes long, and hard casting a Wraith can have its benefits, but early on, cycling Wraith in the face of like Ragavan, Dauthi, Scam Grief, Scam Fury can be a pretty big liability. Thoughtseize, much better on the play, a little bit worse on the draw. Surgical, if you're just like absolutely terrified of the turn 1 Scam, then Surgical can stop that. But if that's not your focal point, I think Surgical's a little bit of card disadvantage because you're just using up a card to try to stop something after they've already probably gotten a card out of you, and I'm just not a big fan of it. Also, it does absolutely nothing against anything that's not an Undying effect. The Spell Pierce, Spell Pierce not coming in for the same reason like Stubbs coming out. And that's that if you have creatures that are surviving, you probably don't need the counter spells. If you don't have creatures, then cards like Stubborn Denial just aren't doing anything. And against a deck that's just 4 Fury, 4 Terminate, Bowmasters, whatever else, the likelihood of not having a creature is pretty high. So I'd rather just keep my threat density up than keep up my density of cards that rely on me having a threat. Boarding in like the extra Narset, just a little extra hopeful card advantage. Boarded in the Stone of Eric because it stops the scam or any undying effect. Boarded in the Unlicensed Hearse for some incidental graveyard hate. Any spot removal spells you have in your sideboard, I'd bring in. So, first hand did a whole lot of nothing. Second hand, we've got a stone. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Turn 1 Ragavan, especially on the draw, is like one of the biggest nightmares for this deck to deal with because you just don't have that many spot removal spells. Usually like 3 or 4 Fatal Push, 1 or 2 Dismember, some Drown in the Locks. And so if you don't have them on turn 1, which you're not guaranteed to have, and you can't really afford to mulligan very low in this matchup, then you're just kind of SOL. This would be a good spot for a card like a Flaying Tendrils. Be able to wipe out everything. So maybe that should be a consideration in the sideboard. Either way, all right, let me talk about mulligan decisions while we're going. I don't want to put in a card like Flaying Tendrils just for one situation that it might have been pretty good. But just something to consider. So on the play, game 3, no lander, got to throw it back. No lander, got to throw it back. Going down to 5. We have a land, but I've got 5 2-drops and a 3-drop. So if I don't see the second land on turn 2, the hand does absolutely nothing. I don't have an answer to a Ragavan unless I hit the second land for Bowmaster. Murktide's dead. Narset's so far away. So I decided to go to 4. Which, obviously, 4 against 6 in the scam matchup is like a death sentence. Here we've got 4. We've got a Hallowed Fountain, so we have no black mana. But I do have a Dismember, so at least I haven't answered like a turn 1 Ragavan, turn 1 scam threat. Decide to keep Bowmaster, Dress Down, Dismember. I figure these are my biggest value cards. Just hope we can hit the second land. Oh, opponent's going to Thoughtseize away my Bowmaster, so... hit the second land, so we've got Dress Down available if they have a scam. They decide to go for nothing, so I'm assuming they've either got like Dolphy and don't want to play it into the Dismember, or maybe Bowmaster or something like that. I can't imagine them not having something to do on turn 2. But we've hit our third land, so most of our deck is functional now. Might not be good enough to win, but it's functional. We just have to decide if we want to sack this stone, which we kind of have to. I know they can have a scam, but we need to have something going on. And picking up Otawara means we can deal with a scam threat. And it turns out our opponent was just sandbagging a Bowmasters, which we kind of figured they would be. But I was also a little bit surprised that they would be that passive with it. And I could have fetched and shocked and hard cast the Street Wraith. I really thought about it, but I figured with Terminate and Fury and all this stuff, they just had way too many ways of dealing with the Street Wraith. So I thought I would just save the Otawara to bounce something and then like hard cast the Street Wraith next turn. So I could at least slow down this clock a good bit. It turns out it was kind of an okay choice because they immediately Blood Moon, which means we have no black mana anymore. But we do have double blue for Counterspell, which in the face of your opponent top decking 4th land and I don't know, maybe like a Shieldred or something, seems pretty okay. Like a Shieldred or something. But we still need pressure. We can't win the game without pressure. That's a pretty good one. So we got to hope they don't have terminate. Well, that's not a terminate. That actually does a whole lot of nothing here. Hearse is a card. Exiling my graveyard is a card. And opponent scoops it up. And yet again, they did not have very friendly words for me in the chat after that one, which I completely understand. We kind of drew hotter than the sun going down the stretch there. And I did get to make my first MTGO Salt Twitter post about it. But yeah, we played the cards to be able to cast the cards. And we won because we cast the cards. On to match number 5. I decided to keep a one-lander on the play. I do have a Street Wraith. I've got some stuff I can draw into. Usually my willingness to keep a one-lander is almost entirely correlational to having Street Wraith in hand. You could keep it off just like a normal cantrip and probably be okay, but with Rogran Triome Plains, I'm kind of assuming my opponent's some sort of Omnath deck, because everybody's an Omnath deck nowadays. I definitely don't want Teferi Resolving, because if you don't know, that card kind of shuts down everything we hold dear in this world. As we look at our hand of Drown, Counterspell, Stubborn Denial. But we pick up our extra land, so like we've got a shadow. We've got some sort of momentum building here. And then I think I punted this game away right here. So my opponent attacks with the Bloodbraid Elf. I'm so positive they've got a Fury. Like, before I block, I'm so sure it's a Fury. And I decide to let them 2-for-1 themselves, so I could just get down another shadow and have some sort of interaction. I kind of figured if they blow a Fury and a red card to deal with my shadow, and I get to play another one, that's a lot better than taking the hit, hitting them back, playing out another shadow, and getting solituded, which I can't stop a solitude. Outside of fatal pushing my own shadow, but then I'm going down to like 1 life, assuming a couple Bloodbraid hits. And so I might have gotten a little more passive than I needed to be there. Shardless Agent's a solid one. I let the Beanstalk resolve. I let the Shardless Agent resolve because I'm kind of thinking, okay, I can like kill something, attack them on the crackback, have lethal, end up going for it, and opponent's got the fire to kill me there. If I'd found a fetch land to be able to just fatal push the Shardless Agent, we would have had it. But again, I think I kind of punted away by not taking that hit off the first Bloodbraid Elf. Sideboarding. Sideboarding against the Beanstalks. Basically chunked all my spot removal out the window. Who cares about Bloodbraid Elves and Shardless Agents? I got bigger things than that. And I want to be counterspelling like Omnath and stuff. If they're running Omnath. Wanted to try out this Surgical Extraction plan. So brought that in. Ended up keeping a hand that had a Drown for a Beanstalk and a Surgical. So hopefully we get to try that out. What else? I could bring in Spreading Seas, but they're pretty good against Blood Moon, so I kind of assume they're going to be pretty good against Spreading Seas as well. And yeah, brought in like extra Stubborn Denial, extra Spell Pierce, just to be able to fight over the rings a little bit more proficiently. Keep a stub on top, because that way they don't have to have a second land or second fetch land for me to be able to counter a Beanstalk. So I'm feeling like pretty good if they go for a Beanstalk and I get to counter Surgical, get Shadow down. Then picking up a Force Negation's nice. I could go for a Shadow, but without a Ferocious enabled Stubborn Denial, I don't think it's worth it. If I had like a Street Wraith or something to enable the Ferocious, then I would. But waiting a turn just means I get like Stub plus Drown, Surgical, Force Negation. Got a Stubble Leyline Binding. We know they can't have Veil of Summer because of the Cascade stuff. We're absolutely countering it to Fairy. So they do have one wide open and enough to Leyline Binding, but if they don't Leyline Binding on their main phase, I kind of assume they don't have another one, because why would you not use it? Why would you let me untap if you've got another Leyline Binding? But I decide, like, I want the extra damage. I want to get this Surgical in and get the Leyline Bindings out of the way. And I see their hand of Omnath, Supreme Verdict, Solitude, Fire and Ice. So absolutely atrocious hand for me to run into is I'm sitting here with like Stubborn Denials and Force Negations against Omnath, Solitude, Supreme Verdict. But at least they don't have Leyline Bindings. And I also notice, if you see on this first column here, 3 copies of Crashing Footfalls. They have boarded out all of their Up the Beanstalks and boarded into Crashing Footfalls, which was so far out of left field from what I was expecting. And now we've got, like, basically nothing going on. I can't play out the second Shadow because I can't stop the Solitude. I can't do anything against the Omnath. So we got about as big brain sideboard juked as you could get. Top deck the Narset, find a Thoughtseize for the Verdict. I'm like, okay, if they hit me, I get down a Shadow. Maybe we're able to rebuild a little bit. And they top decked a Shardless Agent into Rhinos. So we had like the non-creature answer. It was so frustrating because we had the non-creature answers with Stub and Force and Surgical, but they had all creatures in hand with Omnath, Solitude, Supreme Verdict that we can't counter. And then as soon as we start digging out of the creature side a little bit, they top deck the non-creature side when we can't interact with it. I was like, all right, that's Magic for you. So we ended up 4-1 after that absolute destruction we faced in round 5. So ultimately, like, Dimir was fun. Dimir was a lot better than I thought it would be. I think it's still a very good choice against the Fringe decks. I think you've got a lot to overcome against Scam and the Beanstalk decks especially. So if we're going to play more Dimir in the future, we've really got to come up with a solid sideboard plan for those matchups. And I have yet to figure out what I want that to be. So if you got some suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'll have a link to the Twitter if you want to know whenever a live stream of something like this is going live. I have a link to the deck list, link to the Control Freak Discord if you want to come say hey, a link to the Twitch page if you want to come check out a live stream. And other than that, yeah, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your Sunday. Please, if you're liking the content, feel free to hit the follow button. Really trying to get up to that 1K sub mark. Only changes I would really make. Narset was kind of okay. I wouldn't call it great. I don't know if it's good enough to stop these bean decks, especially if they're sideboarding into Rhinos. So not sure what my plan for that's going to be. Unfortunately, like, there's a point where if you're a very reactive deck, there's too many different things to try to overcome. For example, bringing in non-creature counters and having your opponent have Solitudes and Omnaths, bringing in general counter spells, and having all of your opponent's cards be 2-for-1s with like Teferi, the Cascade effects, can't let a Beanstalk resolve. or you bring in counter spells and they have like Supreme Verdict that you can't interact with. So, not really sure what the plan is there, but we got to figure out something because if they're not banning Beanstalk and they're not banning Ring, then we better have a game plan. I would like a couple extra actual removal spells in the sideboard. We've run Infernal Grasp before. I think that's a fine choice. But just something else to fight over Omnath, Scammed Threats, um, Primeval Titan, whatever the case may be. Surgical was meh. I don't think it's a good enough answer against the Beanstalk, and I don't think the other combo matches are popular enough. So yeah, we'll be putting some thought into it. Again, leaving your suggestions so I can try them out. Otherwise, I will catch y'all back live on a live stream probably next week sometime. Hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. Catch you later. Adios for now.